the country. It has thus been a major challenge. It has nonetheless been a major challenge to force a recognition of the degree to which women are the targets of state violence, directly or indirectly. And of course, it is absolutely important that after decades and decades of being the primary organizers of social justice movements, and I think that's probably pretty much the case everywhere, that women do the organizing work. But they are not recognized as leaders. And so, finally we see a situation where women are being recognized as the leaders. But then various veterans, civil rights veterans and public figures have asked of this movement, where are the leaders? Because it appears to be a leaderless movement. And the response has been, we are not a leaderless movement, we are a leaderful movement. And the movement announces that we do not now need the traditional, recognizable, black, male, charismatic leader. Now, which isn't to say that we don't love Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and we don't deeply appreciate their historical contributions, but there is no need to replicate the past. And besides, this is the 21st century, and by now we should have learned that leadership should not be a male prerogative. And since women have always done the work of organizing these movements, so women should be in the leadership. And within the Black movement, we've engaged in these struggles around gender from the very beginning of the 20th century, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s. But finally, we do see a movement that values radical Black women, that values radical Black queer women. And we say that when Black women stand up, as they did during previous eras, during, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott, they were the organizers and the backbone of the boycott, which is what launched the movement we know as the civil rights movement. When they stand up, earth-shaking changes happen. But as historian Barbara Ransby has emphasized, we cannot romanticize leaderlessness. Those who romanticize the concept of leaderless movements often misuse the words of Ella Baker, who said, strong people don't need a strong leader. And Baker developed this message in various iterations over her 50-year career working in the trenches of racial justice struggles. But what she meant was very specific and contextual. She was calling for people to disinvest from the notion of the messianic, charismatic leader who promises political salvation in exchange for deference. And as Ransby also points out, Baker also did not mean that movements would naturally emerge without collective analysis, without serious strategizing, without organizing, without mobilizing, and without consensus building. And so new organizations such as Black Lives Matter, in the US, Dream Defenders and Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide, these are just a few of the new generation organizations that have developed new models of leadership that acknowledge how important Black feminist insights are to the development of viable 21st century radical movements. These movements recognize that as we were asked to say his name, the names of those who have been killed by the police, that we should also be able to say her name and their name as well. They recognize that those who counter the slogan Black Lives Matter with what they assume is a more all-embracing all lives matter are often embracing a strategy that glosses over the particular reasons why it is important to insist quite specifically on an end to racist violence. Similarly, there have been many calls for an end to caste violence, and indeed, as Ambedkar put it, for the annihilation of caste. But it is quite interesting that here in India, and I hope I'm not making the same mistake that Dr. King made in 1959, when I say that the links between casteism and patriarchy, which Ambedkar made, and which Phule before him made, that these links have been more emphatically insisted upon. In the US, it seems that we struggle time and time again to link patriarchy and class and racism. And we discover that women so easily fall out of the frame when we speak about such issues as the violence of over-incarceration and the violence of police surveillance. And even as women are in the leadership of the struggle, we have a hard time creating persuasive arguments for the popular recognition that women are also deeply injured by racist violence, especially in the context of connections with class and with heteropatriarchy. And perhaps in this respect, we might learn something from our Dalit sisters about the importance of linking patriarchy and sexual violence. But let me say before I conclude that as these movements in the US had begun to unfold, we were all quite shocked by the consequence of the last election. Because just as we had grown comfortable with the idea of having a president, as critical as we may have been of his policies, but at least we had a president who garnered respect in the world for his intelligence and seriousness. And this came after 8 years of, do you remember George W. Bush? And now we have a president-elect who, sad to say, causes us to think much better of Bush. Who would have ever thought that was possible? But of course, this election followed 2 terms of the first black president in the history of the U.S. I mean, it's so interesting that that term has been repeatedly used as if we will have the second and third and fourth and fifth. But yes, it was a major shock. But as I reflected on our responses to this election, and some of you may know that people were weeping in the streets when Trump was elected. It was as if we were experiencing the end of the world. Despite the fact that we've also witnessed the emergence of new and vibrant youth movements over the last period. And I reflected on our response to the election of Nixon in 1968, right? And I didn't remember it feeling like the end of the world. Of course, it was terrible that Nixon was elected, but I don't think that we imagined our political expression to be confined by electoral process, the whole electoral process, and so there was promise elsewhere. There was promise in the solidarity that we experienced with people who were struggling for liberation in Africa, in Latin America. There was the Cuban Revolution. There were those in Vietnam who were in the process of defeating, later on, the U.S. invasion. And so it seems that this discussion about solidarities that bring us together across national borders is one that is even more important given the consequences of the last election. And so what do? I think that we continue to build and rebuild and consolidate community, and we recognize that we will have to struggle over the coming period as we have never struggled before. After all, freedom is a constant struggle. Thank you very much.